David Robert Jones was born on January 8, 1947, sharing the same birthday as the American king. The son of a waitress and a charity fundraiser, he was born in Brixton. There were too many suicides for my liking, David admitted in an interview, on my mother's side of the family. The suicides were a symptom of the problem that ran in his family. Madness, more specifically, schizophrenia. On his mother's side, David's aunts Una and Nora Burns were institutionalized schizophrenics, while his aunt Vivian Burns and grandmother Margaret were clearly schizophrenic, though not institutionalized. The skeletons of madness hidden in his family's deep and dark closet would not have been so terrifying had the closet not been opened in his own home, personified in the figure of Terry Burns, David's beloved half-brother on his mother's side. Terry was born 9 years before David, the product of an affair between his mother, Margaret Peggy Burns, and a lover who promised to marry her when she got pregnant, but took off. Terry was dumped in the hands of his maternal grandparents, who reluctantly raised their illegitimate grandson until he was 9 years old. Terry's grandmother, the elder Margaret Burns, was a disturbed woman. While she could be caring and nurturing and loving, she could also be inexplicably cruel and hostile, often turning from gentle to terrifying at the flip of an invisible switch within her mind. When his grandfather was alive, the situation for Terry was very bad, but with the death of his grandfather, everyone agreed that it was far too cruel to leave the poor boy alone with a disturbed and abusive grandmother. He was begrudgingly taken in by a mother who did not want him and a stepfather who would have preferred that he had never been born. Everybody in his family would have preferred that he'd never been born. Everybody except little David. Terry moved into the Jones household when David was just a baby, and they shared a tiny room together for over 6 years. During those years, they were as close as any two brothers could be. A tough, rigid, and very strong woman who had experienced more than her fair share of hard knocks, Peggy was physically unaffectionate with her children. John Jones was traditionally unaffectionate towards his boy as well, a common trait for a Yorkshireman. The only physical affection that either Terry or David experienced in the house was between themselves. On cold mornings, David would crawl into Terry's bed to stay warm. Though he was 9 years older, Terry treated David as a friend rather than as a baby brother. They loved each other dearly. The fact that Terry's mother and stepfather treated him indifferently at the best of times and abusively the rest of the times, while they were unilaterally supportive and indulgent with David, was blatant and unconcealed. David was the golden child. As a child, David idolized his half-brother and immediately followed in all of his interests. When Terry turned 15, his stepfather informed him that he would not support him beyond the minimum age for schooling, which was 15 years old at the time. The Jones family moved from Brixton down to Bromley. Terry was not invited. Peggy found a job for him in Brixton, and a cheap bedsit where he can live on his own and pay his own rent. Terry had no other option but to drop out of school to support himself, even though he was extremely bright and an excellent student. This plan went horribly wrong, however, when Terry's male landlord sexually assaulted him. Terry had to physically fight off the predator and run out of the house, homeless and terrified. He was given temporary shelter by the Jones family, allowed to stay in the tiny box room adjacent to David's bedroom, but he was told in no uncertain terms that his stay could not be indefinite. With nowhere else to go, Terry enlisted in the National Service and served for 3 years overseas in the Royal Air Force. He returned to Bromley at the age of 18 to find that the tiny box room where he thought he could stay was no longer there. His stepfather had torn down the wall between the box room and David's bedroom to give David more space. Fortunately, Terry's maternal aunt, Pat, who had always had a soft spot for the unwanted child, took him in. After Terry's return to London, he and David continued to be very close. Terry would take David to jazz clubs, show him around town, introduce him to hip people, fashion, brown ale, and the vibrant pop culture that was just beginning to swing in London in the early 1960s. David got a saxophone and began taking lessons with a jazz musician, though his interests would soon turn towards pop music. While Terry was somewhat of a jazz snob who chided David on his teenage ambition to become a pop star, he was happy when David took him to his first rock concert in 1967. Cream, playing at the Bromwell Club in Bromley. During the show, Terry began to act strangely. This was not the first time. Terry's behavior had become increasingly erratic over the preceding years. Mild hallucinations, delusions, odd thoughts, magical beliefs. The symptoms had been accruing for some time. At the Cream concert, the incredibly loud and frenetic music and lights were confusing Terry. David took him outside and they started walking home. Suddenly, Terry collapsed on the pavement. He seemed to be having a fit. All the while, he shouted out to David what he was seeing. The cobblestone road dissolving and opening up beneath him, a dark chasm and a vision of hellfire below, while up above he saw a crack in the sky and a whirlwind of flames reaching down to earth. Both brothers were terrified, Terry by what he saw in his mind, and David by what he saw in his brother. Terry was institutionalized in Cane Hill, the infamous mental asylum in Croydon, the London suburb adjacent to Bromley. The ancient, dilapidated Victorian estate turned into a mental hospital was imposing, stark, and cold. The immense gray building loomed over Bromley like a giant gravestone, just as it loomed over David's mind as the prison for his brother. The shadow cast by Cane Hill would shade David's music, art, and lifestyle for the next decade. A strange fascination that intrigued and terrified him. Terry would spend the rest of his brief and tragic life in and out of Cane Hill, a place that he considered to be a living hell. Terry's stepfather experienced a remarkable change of heart. Seeing the once bright and still handsome young man struck low by mental illness, John Jones couldn't help but feel somewhat responsible for the stepson he treated so cruelly, for no other reason than his own shame. The child had grown into a very troubled young man, and it seemed to John that if he had only showed Terry the warmth, love, and acceptance that he shared with David, Terry might not have become so deeply disturbed. Terry was invited to return to the Jones house, which he happily did, and for the next couple of years, Terry's mental health improved. John, the uncaring stepfather that Terry once hated and even wished dead, was now the loving, caring, and supportive father that he never had, but always needed. Things were looking up for Terry, but this is not a happy story. 2 years later, John Jones died prematurely at the age of 56 from cancer. Peggy was unable and unwilling to care for her son on her own, whose behavior, following his stepfather's passing, was increasingly erratic. For the rest of his life, Terry was intermittently employed, and he drifted between his Aunt Pat's house, friends' houses, the streets, and worst of all, Cane Hill. David referred to Terry's influence as the greatest serviceable education that I could have had, because Terry introduced me to the outside things. I saw the magic, and I caught the enthusiasm for it because of his enthusiasm for it, and I kind of wanted to be like him. By his mid-teens, David was playing in rock and roll bands and working hard towards success in the entertainment industry. He tried being a blues rocker, and he also tried being a psychedelic rocker. He tried being a hippie folk musician as well. None of those personas worked out. David's first hit as a recording artist came in the summer of '69 with his single, Space Oddity, a sober reflection on the moon landing. The key to the song, which would also become the key to launching David's career, was the realization that the new type of cultural figure being invented in the moon landing, the spaceman archetype, was the perfect metaphor for David's feelings of alienation within himself. The vast, empty darkness of outer space represented the void of his inner space. If a symbol carries a shared association for everyone who sees it, that symbol transcends the order of personal symbolism and rises to the level of archetype. Truly new and original archetypes only come around once every few thousand years, as a result of a seismic shift in human consciousness. The moon landing provided such a shift. David recognized the significance of this shift in human self-concept, and he symbolized it in the new archetypal figure of the alienated spaceman. He knew that it could communicate to millions or billions, but he had to find a way to drive it into the field of vision of the whole world. The only way to do that, it turns out, was to go beyond just presenting the archetype in a song. David had to become the archetype. Usually, a persona is used to hide or defend one's true self. David turned this around. He created a persona that reflected and projected the shadows within himself. If David was afraid that he would go insane like his brother and wind up a madman locked up in Cane Hill, then he created a persona that not only embraced this fear, but sang about it and even championed it. He channeled the power of the shadow into his work, making it darker, deeper, more resonant, and more engaging. When we don the mask of our own shadow, when the distinction between persona and shadow evaporates and the two become one, we risk losing our bearings, becoming untethered from the part of ourselves that seeks to control the dark impulses within us. The more he spun in his dance macabre with the mad spaceman, the more he became him, and the more he believed in his own drug-fueled delusions and hallucinations. David's 1970 album, The Man Who Sold the World, was the first incarnation of David's new inside-out persona. The subject matter was very telling for me, David admitted in an interview. It was all family problems and analogies put into science fiction form. Cane Hill is featured on the original cover of the album. The second track on the album, All the Madmen, David admitted, was written for my brother, and it's about my brother. David met Angie Barnett, an American actress and model living in London, in 1969. He was 22 and she was just 19. They had a passionate affair and decided to marry in 1970. This was a marriage of convenience. Being married to an Englishman would afford Angie the proper working papers to land roles in London as an actress. while being married to an American would afford David the visas he needed to get gigs to promote his albums in the United States. According to her autobiography, Angie was in love with David, but he was open about the fact that he did not love her. They both described themselves as bisexual at the time. They had an open marriage. Angie also admits that she intentionally got pregnant as a way to keep David closer to her. To make him down to earth, to sort of realize that he's got a family at home, she said. She gave birth to their son, Zoe, now called Duncan, in 1971. The baby, when he arrived, was wanted and loved by both parents, and they enjoyed a brief period of marital bliss. Angie was a rebel and a nonconformist in her sexuality, her fashion, and her approach to life. She inspired David to act and dress more androgynously. The gender-bending fashions, makeup, and hairstyles that made him so glaringly and boldly divergent from the norm in pop music at the time were very much inspired by Angie. David was raised in an extremely heteronormative environment. It was by no means cool when David was growing up in Bromley to be considered gay or effeminate in any way. To the contrary, any young male who defied the heteronormative patriarchy was subject to severe and violent correction at the hands and fists of his peers. The new David that emerged out of the 60s and into the 70s was much more androgynous, much more sexually transgressive, and much more exciting to a new generation of rock fans who were ready, willing, and able to shift the sexual revolution that began in the 1960s into the next gear of the 1970s. The next stage of the revolution was about non-heteronormative sexuality. David would be hailed as a pioneer of this revolution, leading the charge on the rock and roll front. The hermaphrodite archetype is the figure who blends animus and anima, masculine and feminine, male and female, into one androgynous form. This archetype is an ancient and incredibly potent symbol. Revealing the glaring truth that we are all male and female, masculine and feminine, anima and animus combined. A culture that demands dichotomy in the form of strict binary separation and distinction between the sexes is a culture that represses and suppresses the psychological energy or libido of all the people who don't exactly fit into one category or the other. When an archetype emerges that reveals the truth that binary distinctions are merely human constructs, the enormous amount of cultural energy that was being repressed is suddenly released in a tide of identification with that archetype. Carl Jung said, "Whoever speaks in primordial images speaks with 1,000 voices. He enthralls and overpowers, while at the same time he lifts the idea he is seeking to express out of the occasional and the transitory into the realm of the ever-enduring. That is the secret of great art and its effect upon us." The Man Who Sold the World, Bowie's seminal album from 1970, reflects the boldness of an artist who has just grasped an archetypal image and is working it around to figure out how to give it shape. The title track on the album is a double entendre. How could one man sell an entire world? The absurdity of the title sets an existentially ambiguous tone. We passed upon the stair. We spoke of was and when. Although I wasn't there, he said I was his friend. How could he have a conversation with someone who wasn't there? Someone can only be there and not there at the same time if that person doesn't entirely exist. David Jones is telling us, with a wink and a smile, that David Bowie doesn't really exist. David Bowie is an image, an icon, an archetype, a vessel that he could inhabit on his journey to pop stardom. Indeed, the man who sold the world is David Jones. And the product he was selling was David Bowie. Returning to the song, Bowie queries his mysterious doppelganger. I thought you died alone, a long, long time ago, inferring that Bowie thought his double and his creator, Davy Jones, was dead. In creating the icon of Bowie, David left his old persona, Davy Jones, behind for dead. It's a dangerous proposition for an artist, or for anyone, to get so wrapped up and enmeshed in a persona of their own creation that they completely lose themselves in it and forget who they truly are. The doppelganger's reply to Bowie is also the chorus of the song. Oh no, not me, we never lost control. You're face to face with the man who sold the world. The doppelganger insists that he still exists and that he's still in control, but there's a darkness in the reply. David was becoming his own shadow, which, in Jungian terms, is the most dangerous thing a person could do. The album cover sold in England featured Bowie as a beautiful young man with long, beautiful curly blonde hair wearing a beautiful silk dress reclining delicately on a settee. While the image on the cover is extremely effeminate, the music on the vinyl inside the cover is driven by some of the hardest rock music that would ever appear on a Bowie record, a massive departure from his previous sound. The juxtaposition of delicate, effeminate beauty and macho hard rock is the archetypal duality being sold. The androgyny of the David in Drag cover was too sexually transgressive for the American market, where the album was sold with the cover art featuring the drawing of Cane Hill instead. David's next album, Hunky Dory, leads off with Changes, an instant classic that revisits Bowie's angle of encountering his own persona as if he were another person. Changes came to be known as the song that best describes Bowie as an artist, the chameleon of rock and roll, the Proteus of pop. Why must he always be changing? The song itself explains why. In January of 1972, David did an interview with Melody Maker magazine to promote Hunky Dory in a piece entitled Oh You Pretty Thing. In the interview, David came out as gay, a landmark event at the time, as nobody in the public eye had ever come out before, considering it career suicide. Later that year, while on stage at a concert in Dunstable, David simulated fellatio on the neck of his lead guitarist, Mick Ronson's guitar. The image was captured by photographer Mick Rock, and it was soon reprinted and seen by millions. Though it looked like a spontaneous act of stagecraft, the moment was deliberately choreographed by David for the exact purpose of promoting his new transgressional rock and roll persona. At around the same time, Mott the Hoople released a single that was written and produced by David as a gift to the group, All the Young Dudes. It was a hit. A huge hit. When Lou Reed saw Bowie perform the song in London, he raved, "It's a gay anthem, a rallying call to the young dudes to come out in the streets and show that they were beautiful and gay and proud of it." The album that launched David into pop stardom was his masterpiece, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and His Spiders from Mars. The opening track, Starman, is a rock anthem heralding the first coming of the space messiah. The title track, Ziggy Stardust, tells the tale of the decadent lifestyle of a sexually transgressive rocker. In Ziggy, David assembled a mandala of his own archetypal dichotomies. Arranged so skillfully and so artfully that the line between artist and persona, the line between act and actor, ceased to exist. For David, Ziggy had become both his persona and his shadow. In his protean ability to change form at will, Ziggy's creator represented the shapeshifter archetype, the person who survives by adapting. David would have to identify with this specific archetype completely in order to save himself from the doomed fate destined for Ziggy. David was riding a wave of unrepressed psychosexual cultural energy, the released libido of an entire generation of closeted young people. He was also riding a wave of success, fame, and cocaine. While on tour, David got into the habit of shifting into high gear for his nightly stage performance by snorting cocaine, which in turn led to the eventual need to shift into low gear in order to come down and sleep, usually by taking a barbiturate sedative or an opioid such as heroin. The vicious cycle of pharmaceutically induced ups and downs was very easy to slip into, but notoriously hard to break. David had no idea that cocaine, when taken in excess for prolonged periods, produces its own form of psychosis. "That fucker would not leave me alone for years," David said of Ziggy. "My whole personality was affected. It became very dangerous. I really did have doubts about my sanity. I think I put myself very dangerously near the line." David overdosed on both cocaine and heroin multiple times, escaping several close brushes with death. In a desperate effort to ditch his suicidal persona, David decided to preemptively cancel the Ziggy Stardust tour. So he returned to the studio to create a new persona, a lad insane, and recorded the songs he'd written on the road in the US. On the album cover, a lightning bolt in makeup splits his face as if he'd been riven in two by a crack in the sky. Aladdin Sane was a very schizoid record, David admitted in an interview, a very paranoid record made during a period when I really wasn't myself. Honestly, I wasn't really sure who I was, as the whole Ziggy Stardust phenomenon was getting out of control. I was becoming ludicrously successful, but was starting to be surrounded by very strange people, the kind that attach themselves to you when you become famous. There were some very mixed up people on that tour, including myself, and I didn't like myself very much at the time. David employed the cut-up songwriting method in this album. Borrowed from William Burroughs and the Beatnik Writers, it involves cutting up the lyrics, then mixing up the strips of written lines in a hat or a bowl, and then piecing the lines back together in a non-linear fashion. The process relies on random association to create a sense of disjointedness that, nevertheless, creates unexpected meanings or juxtapositions of imagery. The process is a loosening of language into non-linear bursts of consciousness. The so-called word salad of nonlinear psychotic thought. In the song Drive-In Saturday, Bowie sings of Jung the foreman, who prays at work. The image of an inner foreman of the mind is evoked, an internal director of the archetypes at play. Cracked Actor is a portrait of an actor who has fallen so deep in love with his own ego reflection that he can't see that the ego itself has become irrevocably cracked. In the same year, David was also the subject of a BBC documentary by Alan Yentob entitled Cracked Actor. The persona he exuded, the madman prophet, simultaneously fascinated with and alienated from himself, the world, and everything in it, led him to being cast in the lead and titular role of a major motion picture, The Man Who Fell to Earth, as a strange but beautiful alien creature stranded on Earth. David was eerily well suited for the part. David's cocaine use reached its breaking point in Los Angeles in 1975. Yes, David admitted in an interview, I had a strange, psychosomatic sort of death wish, but that's because I was so lost in Ziggy. It was all schizophrenia. In 1975, David's space rocker persona morphed into the most sinister figure he would ever inhabit, the Thin White Duke. His friend and frequent companion during that period was Glenn Hughes, the bassist and singer for the British band Deep Purple. When they met, Hughes was taken aback by David's ultra-thinness. Probably no more than 60 pounds, he said. Glenn admitted that they did become cocaine addicts together. Cocaine is a demonic drug, he said. The cocaine binge deprives the brain of needed sleep and dreaming. When that happens, the mind decompensates and the boundaries between fantasy and reality disappear. The clinical term for this state is substance-induced psychosis. According to Hughes, David was in a very dark place in LA. He was obsessed with Hitler, the occult, and the Third Reich. He believed that his LA house was haunted, that demons were living at the bottom of the pool, and he demanded and received a ritual exorcism. He also believed that a coven of witches in LA were after him, a diabolical plot to put him under a spell and extract his semen in order to bring an unholy offspring of Satan into the world. According to one friend, he had to have cartilage removed from one part of his body and inserted into his nose, because the coke had eaten away his nose cartilage. I would say we were probably both doing 7 grams a day each, Hughes recalled, and that's a lot of cocaine to snort. We had an endless supply of cocaine. Knowing now what I know about cocaine, one of us should have died. At the time he thought he was possessed by the devil, but when you stay up 3 days straight, you're going to start seeing things. We stayed up almost 4 days without sleep. The first album released by Bowie as the Thin White Duke was Diamond Dogs in 1974. It presents a disturbing dystopian vision of urban psychosocial decay, inspired by the Big Brother paranoia of George Orwell's 1984. The tongue-in-cheek camp of Ziggy is gone, replaced by horrifying prophecies of a totalitarian fascist state in a nightmarish near future, vacant of morals or human warmth. The opening track, Future Legend, warns the listener, this ain't rock and roll, this is genocide. Though he weighed only 80 pounds and subsisted on a diet restricted to red peppers, milk, and cocaine, his manic pace of creativity was still prodigious in output, though it was destroying him from within. He drew criticism in the press for making obscure and ill-advised pro-fascist comments, such as declaring that Adolf Hitler was one of the first rock stars, comparing him to Mick Jagger, and praising the brilliance he displayed. He staged a country, David Bowie said. In April of 1976, he was detained by customs in Eastern Europe for the possession of Nazi memorabilia, and in the same month, he was quoted as saying that Britain could benefit from a fascist leader. The Thin White Duke, riding in an open-top Mercedes-Benz convertible, was photographed in a pose that looked exactly like the left-handed Nazi Heil salute. Though the Nazi salute was just a photo that caught the Duke's arm in mid-wave, This nearly fatal miscue was an eye-opening wake-up call. And for a man that was fleeing the specter of madness, the mad irony of his own existence was plain to see. 1976 marked the pinnacle of David Bowie's success as a rock star, and it was also the rock-bottom year for David Jones, the man. His cocaine addiction had reached a critical level. If he didn't stop, he would either die or go completely mad. His marriage to Angie, though never the romantic ideal, was in shambles, and the person really suffering was little Zoe Jones, David's 5-year-old son, who'd been raised by nannies and babysitters in increasingly scattered and unwholesome situations. On top of all that, though David was at the peak of his career as a musician, actor, and recording artist, his personal fortunes were still non-existent because of a horrible contract he signed 5 years earlier with manager Tony DeFries, which essentially guaranteed that nearly all of the money David earned went directly into the pocket of Mr. DeFries. He hadn't seen his mother or Terry since 1972, and he rarely saw his wife and son. In short, David was broke and his personal life was falling apart. In 1976, David dropped out of the rock and roll scene in LA, New York, and London for a period of relative isolation in Berlin. Low, released in 1977, was recycled from the soundtrack he had been working on for The Man Who Fell to Earth, which was rejected by the director. The sullen, despondent, unearthly mood reflects the alienated alien character he was playing in the movie, and also the lowness of David's spirits, the deeply depressed Low following years of being cocaine high. And also, it reflected the low profile he was keeping at the time in Berlin. David was changing up his persona once again, trying to find a safe archetype that he could fit into. And it seems like he settled on that of the subdued and reclusive experimental creative artist. David was also trying to straighten out his personal life. He bought a house in Switzerland for Angie and Zoe, and eventually divorced Angie, gaining full custody of his son. He also gained independence from the manager who had screwed him out of most of his earnings from his first 5 years of stardom. From that point onwards, David would manage himself and would keep his personal life safely separated from his work life. The hero archetype is incomplete without a mentor to guide him. David, in Berlin, set out to encounter and integrate the mentor archetype into himself in order to find balance between David Bowie, the hero star icon, and David Jones, the adult man. First and foremost, David needed to become a mentor to himself, a calm, fatherly, wise old man figure to complement the wild young madman embodied in his rock star persona. Once that was achieved, he could become a father and mentor to his own son, just as David's own father was a parent and mentor to him. At the same time, David was playing the role of mentor to Iggy Pop, a friend in need. Ultimately, David would emerge from his Berlin period as an extremely stable and mature man. In becoming mentor to himself, he not only became his own business manager, director, producer, and agent. He became a responsible father and a guide for others. While David had his ups and downs in the 1970s, his stepbrother Terry had mostly downs. In 1981, Terry was readmitted to Cane Hill. The following year, he attempted suicide by jumping out of a second-story window, but succeeded only in breaking bones. In a tell-all interview with a tabloid news journalist, David's Aunt Pat made a public airing of the family's dirty laundry, shaming and guilting David into visiting Terry, and breaking the 10-year stretch of no contact between them. David brought Terry gifts and, according to Aunt Pat, promised to get him out of Cane Hill and find him the best treatment money could buy. Terry was overjoyed by David's visit and his promises, giving Terry hope for the future and a new lease on life. David went off to star in a feature film, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, where, in an interview, he reflected on his family and his avoidance of them. "I feel tremendous guilt," he said, "because I grew so apart from my family. I hardly ever see my mother, and I have a half-brother I don't see anymore. It was my fault we grew apart, and it is painful, but somehow there is no going back." Years passed, but Terry was still wasting away at Cane Hill, and David never returned. In 1984, 2 days after Christmas, Terry lay down across the tracks before an oncoming train. When the train was just a few feet away, Terry skittered in between the tracks, and the train passed over him. A couple of weeks later, Terry corrected his mistake by resting only his head on the tracks before the oncoming train. He was 47 years old. To avoid a media frenzy, David did not attend the funeral, but he did send flowers with a card that read, "You've seen more things than we can imagine, but all these moments will be lost, like tears washed away by the rain. God bless you, David." The sentiment was, of course, highly symbolic, but only those who really knew David and his complicated relationship with Terry would be able to understand it. The quote was drawn from the remarkable science fiction film Blade Runner, released a couple of years before. In the film, Roy is a replicant, an android who looks, feels, thinks, and loves just like a man. Just before he dies, he recites the line, "I've seen more things than you can imagine." Roy was a replicant, not a real person, yet he lived and loved like a real human being. He died because he could not exist in a world where everything was real except himself. Once again, David was using science fiction as a metaphor for the alienation he felt inside of himself and that he identified with in his half-brother Terry. "One puts oneself through such psychological damage trying to avoid the threat of insanity," David remarked in an interview. "You start to approach the very thing that you're scared of. Because of the tragedy inflicted especially on my mother's side of the family, there were too many suicides for my liking, that was something I was terribly fearful of. I felt I was the lucky one because I was an artist, and it would never happen to me because I could put all of my psychological excesses into my music, and then I could always be throwing it off." The primary conflict for David in his Berlin years was his struggle for sobriety. It took a long time for David to get his drug problem under control in Berlin. "It's very hard just to give up," he admitted. "You go through a lot of dreadful things giving up, a lot of depression, a lot of switching addictions. In my case, I switched to alcohol. My problem was cocaine, and then I went from cocaine to alcohol." David's comeback album, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, released in 1980, was a tour de force of the pop meets art rock sensibility. "There was a certain degree of optimism making Scary Monsters," David disclosed in an interview, "because I'd worked through some of my problems. I felt very positive about the future, and I think I just got down to writing a really comprehensive and well-crafted album." The album was a critical and financial success, bringing David back into the mainstream fold of pop superstars. The cover art featured David dressed as Pierrot, the tragically sad clown, a costume which David also wore in the music video for the album's primary single, Ashes to Ashes. In a 1979 interview, David admitted, "I'm Pierrot. I'm Everyman, the eternal clown putting over the great sadness." Pierrot as an archetype also represents the duality of the cracked actor playing the part of the sad clown, the alienated artist who plays the fool to make his audience laugh, while on the inside he cries. On the left side of the album cover, David as Pierrot looks forward, while on the right side, his shadow lurks. Inside the shadow are hazy silhouettes of David in his previous personas. The message seems to be that David is moving forward, while acknowledging that wherever we go, the shadow of our former selves is never far behind. In Ashes to Ashes, David revisits the character of Major Tom from A Space Oddity. The phrase ashes to ashes is said at funerals, giving the impression that David is burying this former version of himself because he descended into junkiedom. However, just by acknowledging his former self, David is also saying that one's past could never be completely buried away, as he explained in an interview. You have to accommodate your past within your persona. You have to understand why you went through them. You cannot just ignore them to put them out of your mind or pretend they didn't happen, or just say, oh, I was different then. Ashes to Ashes is both a funeral for David's former self and a post-mortem, a testament to the ironic, topsy-turvy life of the rock star drug addict, whose highest high is also his lowest low. The song expresses the fear that can never be completely dispelled, as it's a fear of what David might do if he ever loses control of himself again. Or more simply, David's fear of himself, the scariest monster of all. Let's Dance in 1983 was the first opportunity for David to really make some big-time rock star money, and that's exactly what transpired. The album was a monster hit that made him a fortune. The cover art features a muscular and tan David, a complete reversal from the deathly pale and skeletal images of his 1970s personas. David is dressed in boxing gear, fists clenched, with his shadow sheltered behind him, as if he were defending it rather than running from it. By the late 1980s, David had relinquished his top-of-the-pop status and persona by moving on from it. For the rest of his career, he kept changing, reinventing himself, finding deeper and darker musical caves to explore. He also spent the rest of his career expanding as an actor on both the stage and screen, broadening his palette as a painter and a collector. And in 1993, David married again, this time for love rather than a green card. He had a daughter and lived peacefully with his family in his homes in New York and London for the last decades of his life. He also nurtured a healthy, loving relationship with his son, who changed his name from Zoe to Joe before settling on Duncan Jones, who is now a successful filmmaker. For the rest of us, David left an inspiring legacy of self-determination, sexual liberation, and non-conforming gender identification that was formative and seminal for an entire generation. I'm glad I did everything. I really am, he admitted in an interview. Naturally, I had advised my son not to even think about it because I know the inherent dangers of doing it. Somehow or other, I went through a whole series of survivals and crawled out of it all. And somehow, having gotten away with it, I'm really glad that I did it. But it's like if I said to my son, yeah, Joe, I think it's great for you to get into a shuttle and be shot at 1,000 miles an hour to the moon. I don't want him to get in it in case it blows up. But I know what he means because, like, whoa, the journey is like outer space. He died 2 days after his 69th birthday of liver cancer, just like his father, a disease often associated with heavy substance abuse. Nevertheless, David was honest about his experience, in terms of not only the dangers and costs, but the benefits as well, though they come at the risk of great personal peril. I'm not suggesting for one small minute that you rush out and get your junkie kit together. Not at all. It's just interesting that people who make those explorations, if they go through the cusp of those explorations, they do tend to come out on the other side, in a way, better people for it, That's a dangerous thing to say, but it's true in my case. In weighing the clear risks versus the potential benefits, however, David was quite clear on his stand on the issue, by revealing the advice he would give to a person whom he loved and cared about more than himself. his son. The single most important message I could give him still is, never even consider becoming involved with drugs. It's something I could never underestimate the importance of. It's absolutely tragic what it can do to you and how it can screw you up.